2 days before my wedding, my sister-in-law pulled me aside and whispered something that made my stomach drop. My mom bought a white dress, and she plans to wear it to your wedding. What happened after that warning turned my entire wedding day into something nobody expected. My name is Lily Anderson, and I'm 56 years old now. But the story I'm about to tell happened many years ago when I was preparing for what I thought would be the happiest day of my life. Back then, I believed weddings were simple. You planned the flowers, picked a dress, invited the people you loved, and promised to spend the rest of your life with the person standing beside you. What I didn't realize was that sometimes the real drama doesn't come from strangers. It comes from family. I met my husband, Daniel, when I was 27 years old. We worked in the same office building downtown. I was an accountant for a small consulting company, and he worked in a marketing firm 2 floors above us. Our first conversation happened in the elevator. It was one of those awkward moments where 2 strangers ride together in silence until someone says something polite. Daniel smiled and asked if I worked in the building. We started talking, then laughing. Then somehow we ended up getting coffee together that afternoon. Within 6 months, we were inseparable. Daniel was kind, calm, and thoughtful, everything I had been looking for. But like every relationship, it came with a family attached. And Daniel's family was complicated. His father was quiet and polite. His younger sister, Rachel, was warm and friendly. But his mother, Patricia, was something entirely different. Patricia was the kind of woman who liked attention. She spoke loudly. She had opinions about everything. And she had a habit of making every event somehow revolve around her. The first time I met her, she hugged Daniel tightly and then looked me up and down. "So you're the girl," she said. I smiled politely. "Yes." She didn't smile back. "Well," she said slowly, "we'll see how long that lasts." Daniel later told me not to take it personally. "That's just how she is," he said. And for a while, I tried to believe that. But over the next 2 years, Patricia made it very clear that she wasn't thrilled about me joining the family. Whenever we visited for dinner, she found small ways to criticize things. My cooking, my job, even my dress choices. "You work too much," she once told me. "Daniel needs someone who focuses on family." Another time she said, "That color doesn't suit you." It wasn't openly cruel, just constant little comments. Rachel noticed it too. One evening, after Patricia left the table, Rachel leaned closer to me. "Don't worry about her," she whispered. "She does this to everyone." Despite Patricia's attitude, Daniel proposed 2 years later. It happened during a quiet weekend trip by the lake, just the 2 of us. Simple. Perfect. I said yes immediately. When we told his family, Rachel hugged me excitedly. Daniel's father shook my hand warmly. But Patricia's reaction was strange. "Oh," she said flatly. "Well, I suppose that was inevitable. That was it. No excitement. No congratulations. Just that." Still, I told myself things would improve. Maybe once the wedding planning started, she would soften. Maybe she just needed time. The wedding planning began 6 months later. We chose a beautiful garden venue, white roses, soft lights, and a small outdoor ceremony surrounded by trees. Exactly the kind of peaceful wedding I had always imagined. Rachel helped me with almost everything: dress fittings, decorations, guest lists. She was more excited than anyone else. But Patricia stayed oddly distant. She never offered to help, never asked about details, and she rarely came to planning meetings. At first, I thought she just wasn't interested. But 2 days before the wedding, Rachel called me. Her voice sounded nervous. "Lily, can we talk?" "Of course, not on the phone." That worried me. "Okay, can we meet at the cafe near your apartment?" "Sure." When I arrived, Rachel was already sitting at a table near the window. She looked uncomfortable, like someone trying to decide how to deliver bad news. "What's wrong?" I asked as I sat down. Rachel glanced around to make sure no one was listening. Then she leaned closer. "My mom bought a dress for the wedding." "That's normal," I said. Rachel shook her head slowly. "You don't understand." My stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" Rachel lowered her voice. "It's white." I blinked. "White?" She nodded. "Completely white. Lace. Long skirt." For a moment, I didn't know what to say. Everyone knows the one rule about weddings. Only the bride wears white, Rachel continued quickly. And she's been telling people she wants to look elegant enough to stand beside her son. The meaning of that sentence hit me immediately. She wanted attention. She wanted to compete. At my wedding, I stared at Rachel. Are you serious? Rachel Sahil, I saw the dress yesterday. And she's definitely wearing it? Rachel nodded again. She even said it out loud. My heart started beating faster. Why would she do that? Rachel hesitated, then said quietly, I think she wants to make the day about her. I leaned back in the chair, stunned. 2 days before my wedding, and Daniel's mother was planning to show up dressed like another bride. Rachel reached across the table. I thought you deserved to know. I looked at her gratefully. Thank you. She squeezed my hand. So, what are you going to do? That was the question. Because confronting Patricia directly would cause drama. Ignoring it might ruin the ceremony. But as I sat there thinking about it, a small idea began forming in my mind. An idea Patricia definitely wouldn't expect. I looked back at Rachel slowly, then I smiled. Well, I said calmly, if she wants to wear white to my wedding. Rachel blinked. Then maybe I'll let her. Rachel stared at me in confusion, because what she didn't realize yet was that Patricia's plan to steal attention on my wedding day was about to backfire in the most unforgettable way possible. When I told Rachel, maybe I'll let her wear white, she stared at me like I had completely lost my mind. Lily, are you serious? She asked. I nodded slowly and took a sip of my coffee. Rachel leaned closer across the table. You know what that means, right? Everyone will be staring at her. People will whisper. It could ruin your ceremony. I understood exactly what she meant. Weddings have one unspoken rule that almost everyone respects. Only the bride wears white. Anyone else doing it is usually seen as disrespectful. Or worse, attention-seeking. But as I sat there thinking about Patricia's personality, something became very clear. If I tried to stop her, she would turn it into a scene. If I confronted her, she would probably pretend to be the victim. And if I warned the family, the drama would start before the wedding even began. Patricia loved attention, especially dramatic attention. So instead of fighting her plan, I decided to do something she would never expect. I smiled calmly at Rachel. Trust me, I said. Rachel raised an eyebrow. That's not very comforting. I have an idea. What kind of idea? The kind that lets your mom embarrass herself. Rachel blinked. Then she slowly started smiling. Oh, now I'm interested. But before I explained anything, my phone buzzed. Danielle. Hey, I answered. Hey, he said warmly. How's wedding planning chaos? I laughed softly. Almost done. Good, he said. Mom said she bought her dress today. Rachel looked at me immediately. I covered the phone slightly and whispered, See? Then I spoke again. Oh, really? I asked Daniel. Yeah. She said it's elegant. I'm sure it is. Daniel paused for a moment. You sound mysterious. Do I? Yes. Well, I said lightly. You'll see the surprise on the wedding day, Daniel chuckled. I'm both excited and slightly concerned. Don't be. After we ended the call, Rachel leaned forward. So what's the plan? I lowered my voice. If your mom wants attention, we'll give it to her. Rachel looked confused again. What do you mean? I thought carefully before answering. Right now she thinks wearing white will make people compare her to me. Rachel nodded slowly. That's probably exactly what she wants. Right. So we change the comparison. Rachel's eyes widened slightly. You're plotting something, maybe. She leaned back in her chair, smiling with curiosity. I suddenly feel very proud of warning you. The next 2 days passed quickly. Wedding rehearsals, decorations, guests arriving in town. Everyone was excited. Everyone except Patricia. She stayed strangely quiet during the rehearsal dinner. But I caught her smiling at one point while talking to a few relatives. And when I heard one of them say, "That sounds like a beautiful dress," I knew exactly what they were discussing. Her white dress. Rachel noticed it too. She leaned toward me and whispered, "She's definitely wearing it." I know. Stay calm. I smiled. Still calm. The morning of the wedding arrived with clear blue skies. Our garden venue looked beautiful. White chairs lined the aisle. Flowers decorated the arch where Daniel and I would say our vows. Soft music played while guests began arriving. Rachel helped me with my dress inside the bridal suite. You look amazing, she said as she adjusted the veil. I smiled at my reflection. But honestly, I wasn't thinking about the dress. I was thinking about Patricia. Rachel seemed to read my thoughts. "She's here," she said quietly. My eyes met hers in the mirror. "And?" "She's wearing the dress." "White?" Rachel nodded. "Completely white." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Rachel suddenly started laughing. "Lily, I almost feel bad for her." "Why?" "Because I'm pretty sure she has no idea what's about to happen." I smiled slightly. "Probably not." A few minutes later, the wedding coordinator knocked on the door. "5 minutes," she said. My heart started beating faster, not from fear, from anticipation. Because in just a few minutes, Patricia was about to walk into the garden wearing her dramatic white dress, and she was expecting admiration, attention, maybe even confusion. What she didn't know was that my quiet plan had already turned her little stunt into something very different. And when the ceremony began, the moment she stepped into the aisle, the reaction from the guests would leave her completely speechless. When the wedding coordinator said, 5 minutes, the room suddenly felt very quiet. Rachel finished adjusting my veil and looked at me in the mirror. "Last chance to panic," she joked. I smiled. "I'm not panicking. You're either incredibly calm or incredibly dangerous right now. Maybe both." Rachel laughed softly, but I could tell she was curious. She still didn't fully understand the plan, and honestly, that was part of the reason it would work so well. Outside the bridal suite, I could hear guests taking their seats. Soft music played in the garden. The air smelled like roses and freshly cut grass. It was exactly the kind of peaceful wedding atmosphere I had dreamed about. But somewhere out there in the crowd, Patricia was sitting proudly in her white dress, probably expecting whispers of admiration, maybe even hoping people would confuse her for the bride's mother, or worse. Rachel suddenly peeked through the window overlooking the garden. "Oh wow," she whispered. "What?" "She's sitting in the front row." Of course she was. That didn't surprise me at all. Patricia had never been shy about putting herself in the spotlight. Rachel turned back toward me. "And Lily, the dress really is white." "How white?" "Like bridal boutique white." I couldn't help laughing quietly. "Well," I said, "that should make things easier." Rachel raised an eyebrow again. "I wish I knew what you meant by that." Before I could answer, the wedding coordinator knocked again. "It's time." My heart started beating faster now. Not from anxiety, but from excitement. Rachel squeezed my hand. "Whatever you're planning," she said, "I'm on your side." "Good." Then she leaned closer and whispered something that made me laugh. "My mom is about to learn the difference between attention and embarrassment." The ceremony began a few moments later. I waited in the small room behind the garden while the music played. Through the open doorway, I could hear the guests settling into their chairs. Daniel stood at the front of the aisle, waiting. The officiant began speaking softly, and then the music changed. My cool. Rachel gave me one last smile. "Ready?" "Very." When the doors opened, the sunlight poured into the hallway. I stepped forward slowly, my father beside me. Guests turned their heads toward the aisle, and immediately I noticed something interesting. People weren't just looking at me, they were also glancing toward the front row, toward Patricia. Even from a distance, her white dress stood out clearly among the guests. It was long, elegant, almost bridal, exactly the statement she wanted to make. But what she hadn't expected was what the guests had already been told. The night before the wedding, during the rehearsal dinner, I had quietly spoken with the officiant and the wedding coordinator. I didn't accuse Patricia of anything. I simply made a small announcement during the rehearsal speech. I smiled warmly and said, "Tomorrow is going to be a beautiful celebration, and we're so lucky to have family members who love the spotlight just as much as we do." People laughed politely. Then I added something else. "So, if you see anyone wearing white besides the bride, please remember it's not a mistake. It's just someone who really wants to be part of the show." That line spread through the entire guest list within minutes. Family whispered it to friends. Friends whispered it to other guests. By the time the ceremony began, everyone already understood what wearing white at someone else's wedding meant. And now, as I walked slowly down the aisle, those same guests were glancing toward Patricia with raised eyebrows. Some were smiling, some were whispering quietly. Others were trying very hard not to laugh. Patricia sat proudly in the front row, completely unaware. But Rachel noticed. As I passed her seat, she leaned slightly toward me and whispered, "It's working." I kept my expression calm, but inside I felt a small wave of satisfaction, because the attention Patricia wanted was turning into something else entirely. I reached the end of the aisle where Daniel stood waiting. He smiled at me, completely focused on the moment. "You look incredible," he whispered. "Thank you." Then the ceremony began. The officiant spoke about love, partnership, and the journey of marriage. But I noticed something interesting happening among the guests. Every so often, someone would glance toward Patricia again. And each time they did, the whispers continued. Eventually, Patricia seemed to notice. Her confident smile faded slightly. She shifted uncomfortably in her chair, looking around at the curious faces, trying to understand why people were reacting that way. Rachel sat beside her, trying very hard not to laugh. The ceremony continued peacefully. Daniel and I exchanged vows. We held hands. We promised to support each other through everything life would bring. And finally, the officiant said the words everyone was waiting for. "You may kiss the bride." The guests applauded loudly. But the real moment came a few minutes later, when the ceremony ended and everyone stood up to greet us. Because that's when Patricia finally heard the whispers directly, and the realization of what people thought about her white dress would hit her all at once. After Daniel and I kissed and the guests applauded, the ceremony officially ended. Music started playing again. As everyone stood up from their chairs, people began moving toward the garden path where the reception area had been prepared. It should have been a joyful, relaxed moment, but something else was happening. I could see guests whispering to each other. Some were smiling, others looked amused, and almost all of them glanced at Patricia as they walked past her. At first, she didn't seem to understand why. She stood up confidently in her white lace dress, smoothing the fabric proudly. From a distance, she probably believed she looked elegant, maybe even impressive. But as more guests passed by, the reactions became harder to ignore. One older aunt leaned toward another guest and whispered something. They both laughed quietly. Another group walked past Patricia and gave her a very obvious look before continuing toward the reception tables. Rachel noticed everything. She stood beside her mother with a polite smile that looked almost heroic considering how hard she was trying not to laugh. Meanwhile, Daniel and I were greeting guests near the flower arch. Friends hugged us. Family members congratulated us. Everything felt warm and joyful. But in the corner of my eye, I kept seeing Patricia looking more and more confused. Eventually, she approached us. Her expression was tight, forced. "Lovely ceremony," she said. "Thank you," I replied politely. Daniel hugged her quickly. "Glad you made it, Mom." But Patricia wasn't really focused on the wedding anymore. She kept glancing at the nearby guests, almost like she was trying to catch the whispers she kept hearing. Then one of Daniel's cousins walked up to greet us. "Beautiful wedding," she said warmly. Then she turned to Patricia and added with a slightly amused smile, "And your dress is very bold." Patricia smiled proudly. "Thank you." But the cousin's tone had a hint of something else. Something Patricia didn't quite understand yet. Another guest approached a few minutes later, a friend of Daniel's father. He shook Daniel's hand and congratulated us. Then he looked at Patricia. "Well," he said carefully, "someone certainly enjoys being the center of attention." The man walked away before Patricia could reply. Her smile slowly disappeared. She turned to Rachel. "What's that supposed to mean?" Rachel shrugged innocently. "I don't know, Mom." But I could see Rachel's shoulders shaking slightly. She was barely holding back laughter. By the time the reception started, Patricia had begun noticing the pattern. Guests were polite, but their smiles had an amused edge. Some whispered to each other when she passed. Others gave her sympathetic look. Finally, Patricia approached me again. This time, she sounded irritated. "Lily," she said quietly, "why are people acting strange?" I looked at her calmly. "What do you mean?" She gestured toward the crowd. "Everyone keeps staring at me." I pretended to think for a moment. "Well, maybe they're admiring your dress." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "I don't think that's it." Rachel suddenly appeared beside us holding 2 glasses of champagne. "Mom," she said casually, "you might want to hear what people were talking about at the rehearsal dinner." Patricia frowned. "What rehearsal dinner?" Rachel smiled sweetly. "The one where Lily explained the dress situation." Patricia blinked. "What situation?" Rachel leaned slightly closer. "She told everyone that if someone wore white besides the bride, it probably meant they wanted attention." Patricia froze. For a second, she didn't move at all. Then slowly, she turned toward the guests. A group nearby was whispering again. One woman noticed Patricia, looking and quickly looked away. Another guest smiled awkwardly. And suddenly, Patricia understood everything. The whispers, the glances, the strange compliments. They weren't admiring her. They were laughing at her. Her face turned red. "You told people that?" she asked me sharply. I kept my voice calm. I didn't mention any names. "But you knew I bought a white dress." Rachel coughed softly to hide a laugh.